Hey tribe, it's Seim here, and on today's video, I'm going to show you why you don't need this, and you probably don't need this either, and if you wanted to, you could probably use this, and it would give you the same result as using this or even this. Let me get to the punchline first, because you know I like to do this, so if you guys find it interesting, you can listen through the end. Please click that like and subscribe button. Leave a comment. Tell me if you think I'm crazy. I was there when digital first started going pro. I remember having those early cameras, and I remember us always talking about and agonizing over white balance. Oh, white balance this and white balance that. And it seemed like we kind of forgot that we basically had two different white balances when we were shooting film. We had normal daylight and we had tungsten film, and most of us were using normal daylight. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't other films and other things you could do, but those were the two common films. And a lot of films we were shooting only had daylight. And if you had a white balance issue, you just put a filter on it. Well, fast forward to the digital age, and now we're shooting these files in JPEG, or preferably in RAW is even better, because then there's no loss. We're in a digital editor, and we can make our white balance whatever we want. The first thing I want to do is explain what these are used for. You've probably used one before. You can take one of these, and if you go in, you can take your color picker right up here in whatever app you're using. I'm using Lightroom. And then you can do a white balance based on that of a neutral white balance. And you'll even find disputes and differences between different brands. The X-Rite is going to be different than the generic. It's going to be different than this one. Somebody's going to be using an 18% gray. Another one's going to be using white. Because really what you're white balancing to is neutral. And you're gonna find purists that are gonna be like, no, you have to white balance this way. No, you need to put this in front of your lens. No, you need to adjust in camera and do the targeting. And then you need to do the XY coordinates and bring that in from the Zeta. But you know what? None of that actually matters. Auto white balance in virtually any camera I've used in the past decade is almost always correct, okay? But especially if I'm shooting RAW. Yes, we can edit white balance on the JPEG, but now you're effectively adding a color tint. When you shoot RAW, you're not losing any information. All the white balancing you can do in your camera, you could spend all day and do all the white balancing, and all it's doing is putting a marker in your RAW file that says, well, this is what we're white balanced to. What that means is if you go over here and you change the white balance here in Lightroom, it's no different than changing it in camera, except you can do it whenever you want. If I white balance to middle gray, it goes to 5124, all right? If I white balance to the lighter of the neutral targets, it's 4850 and 26. If I white balance to black, it's 4916. Again, going back to as shot, we varied just a little bit in each direction. If I were to take 5 different white balance cards and shoot them all, they would come out differently. The issue with white balance is you need to stop worrying about white balance. What's your visualization? You're taking a photo, you want it to look how? Do you want it to be warm? You want it to be cool? You want it to be moody? There is no correct white balance, because what the reflection of a piece of paper or a piece of gray says to your photo, do you think when Rembrandt or Albert Bernstein made a painting, they were like, well, what's the correct middle gray for this? No, they were creating a visualization. So if you want good white balance, sure, you can go through a bunch of hoops. You can use a card. And I'm not saying there's never a time to use a card or a target. Video, normally we're not shooting in RAW. So sometimes if you have a difficult lighting situation, normally auto works fine. I almost never white balance even for video, because auto white balance in camera is seeing what's going on, and it normally white balances correctly. But if I was shooting something really important, if I had difficult lighting, like a lot of times we encounter maybe in a wedding, in a night scene, it might be good to have a target reference. Here is a portrait I took the other day. This is straight RAW right here. Now, I can tell right off that I want to increase this about a half a stop on exposure, okay? You know, if I've showed you my formulas and my workflow, that I do a few things. Good presets should never modify your white balance and never modify your exposure. Well, not never, but most of the time they shouldn't, because those are variables that aren't predictable enough. I come in here and the first thing I'm doing is saying, I want my exposure right, just like I showed you guys in the Lightroom workshop. When we're grid editing, we can do that in mass to make an entire wedding expose correctly in 10 minutes. If I come in here now, I'm looking at as shot, it looks pretty good. I could look at auto, and it's a little green, okay? I'm gonna leave it as shot. But you know what I could do really is not worry about it, not think about it. Unless the white balance is just way off, I'm not gonna think about the white balance until after I apply a formula. Because the formula is my film, right? The formula is what I'm coming in, and I'm coming in with a raw file from a given camera, and then I'm gonna come in with a formula to get the kind of color grade. How do I want the greens to be managed? How dark do I want the lights to be? How bright do I want the reds versus the yellows? And the reason I create formulas and presets and put so much blood, sweat, and tears into those is because a good formula gets you your color grade. Your white balance is just an add-on tool on top of that. Let me show you what I mean. Go back to the screen, and I'm gonna go down and go to something like Fuji Pro 400H. It's a little red. Let me use one of the variants like Fuji Pro 400E. I like this a little bit better because I like the warmer tone a little bit better. Now I'm just gonna drop my clarity a little bit more, okay? And where we started, and now. I've ran a formula on this that gives me kind of the filmic look I want. There's a little grain in there, there's some detail. All I need to do now with white balance, if anything, if I want to do anything, all I'm going to do is tweak it a little bit up and down and say, do I want it a little warmer maybe? No, that's too warm. Do I want to pull a little more red? No, it's too green. Do I want to put more red in? And so I will tweak with this. And you know what? I find this a lot. If I set this to as shot, it looks pretty good with this formula. But when it was as shot before I applied my Fuji formula I just applied, it's a little red. In fact, especially in Lightroom, Fuji cameras tend to be a little magenta. They tend to lean a little red to me. But it's not a white balance issue. It's just how they're interpreting the color. So how one camera interprets the color can be more of a distinction than the difference between spending a lot of time using a card or just coming in and leaving your white balance auto in camera. I do find that auto white balance in camera works better most of the time than auto white balance in Lightroom in Capture One, okay? I can go auto, the auto looks pretty good. Now I like it. And then I'm sitting here and I'm sitting here, I'm looking at this for a few minutes and I'm like, oh no, it's kind of green. Let's go back. Let's go back to a shot. Well, maybe it's a little red. Let's go back to auto, okay? No, let's go to auto and then put a little bit of warmth back in. Oh, that's nice. That seems like a good skin tone. But what makes it a good skin tone? You do. You're using different cameras and different files and all these different tools, but ultimately only you can take an image and look at it and say, this is a good skin tone or this isn't a good skin tone. As I've been filming this video, the light outside the window is changing. My exposure, the way you perceive light in this whole room has changed. I'm honestly a little overexposed right now. So if you go to a reception hall and you gray card, unless you're doing it every frame, it's pointless. You'd be better off if you really want to use that eyedropper tool to have the computer tell you where is good white balance, is use auto white balance and then just click around in things that look neutral. Because as we showed looking at the gray card, the difference between the white swatch and the black swatch and the neutral swatch aren't that different because they're all a neutral target. That's why if you have something white or even a piece of paper from a wedding invitation sitting on the table, it's probably going to be a suitable target to do that. And even if you have a perfect target in your image, you'll find a lot of times you'll target from that and you're like, that's not what I wanted. Because it's not about what this says is correct white balance. It's not about what this says is correct white balance. And it's not about what this is. You can use those as tools, as learning aids, as consistency aids. I'll come back to that in a second to get you better results. But ultimately, you decide what the correct white balance is. So if you're shooting something like a commercial session, if you're shooting a studio session with a white backdrop, for example, if you're shooting the formals at a wedding, where everything's going to be consistent, the light's not going to change and it's going to be consistent, it might be good to use a target because then you can come and target off that and copy that to all the other images so they're all using consistent white balance because the auto white balance might vary throughout those sessions. And in that case, obviously, you probably want your consistency to look the same. But a piece of paper would get you just about as close. Another raw file looks pretty good, but it needs kind of some dynamic range. The exposure's good. We're a little blown out here. I'm gonna go straight to something like natural HDR. And I'm just gonna start going through and find a natural HDR that looks good for this. Maybe earthscape, waterscape. Okay, these are nice. I like mistscape for this. I like what it's doing to the greens back here. But look how blue this water is, even though the background looks pretty good. How do we white balance this? Okay, let's white balance this. This is as shot. Now watch what happens. I could do auto, and that's pretty good. It's a little warm. I'm gonna undo that. You know what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click the dropper, and I'm gonna white balance off this water right here. Look what just happened. All the color, all the blue hue just left the water because I told Lightroom, oh, the water is neutral. The water should be neutral color, and it white balanced based on that. Now, did I go even a little too far? Maybe, but I'm doing a landscape. This is a single image. It just needs to look the way I want it to look. So now I'm gonna go and say it's a little too warm. I like the warmth, but I'm gonna back it off a little bit, okay? So now our water feels real, our water feels natural. Now we have this lovely image. I can crop it in, I could take it into Photoshop and do some more work on it. I can say, okay, where do I want my frame to start and end? But I got nice detail, I've got some dynamic range control, and just from there to there. Why? Because I first applied a formula. I thought, what's my visualization? What do I want the aesthetic, the color mix, the formula? Do I want to focus on dynamic range? Do I want to focus on filmic looks? If I was doing portraits or something like that, I might use my Belladonna or my Filmist or my Muse presets. You may be using different tools. You might be using your own. As long as you have a good system in place. I always laugh when I see these ads for like, oh, 3,000 presets for $29. I'm like, why would I want to go through and sort through the 3,000 presets you made because you couldn't actually take the time to develop your formulas down to make 50, 60, 70 really good formulas based on whatever theme you were creating. And sometimes we go out and we buy gadgets, and there is a time to have an X-Rite color checker. There's a time to have a gray card. There's a time for all of these tools where they can be really useful. So I'm not here to knock the tools so much as to say, most of the time you don't need them. Stop fretting about white balance. And a lot of times you'll find when you're shooting later at night, your white balance tends to get a little trickier. But these same principles apply. Auto doesn't work here. It makes her way too green. The auto or the in camera as shot looks pretty good. She might be a little bit red, but I'm just gonna go here. We got a portrait. I'm gonna use Belladonna. I'm gonna use something like the Atmosphere 2 preset, and that puts my formula on. Now that I have my formula, I can then tweak that formula if need be. I might say, oh, I want less clarity. Oh, I wanna put a vignette mod. Let's do that. So I could build my look, and now I'm looking at this image and I'm saying, well, is it good? Well, does it meet my visualization? Is this what I want to present to my model, to my client, to my viewers on Instagram? Is this what I want to print? That's the only real question that you have to answer. And if the answer is yes, you're there. You might look at an image and a few minutes later you're like, why? No, it doesn't look quite right. I feel like there's too much red. So experiment, but do white balance last. Apply your formula, adjust your exposure, get your image looking great, and then come in and say, oh, what happens if I pull just a touch of red out? Or maybe if I just make this scene a little more blue, that might look cool because it's clearly kind of this evening scene. We're in an alley. So what if I pull a little bit of blue? What if I pull a lot of blue? Now it's too much. See what I'm doing here? I've applied a formula and now I'm using the white balance as an aid to that formula. And where did we go? From here to here. Then white balance becomes a tool instead of a blockade in my path. Because when I'm always worrying about white balance, is the white balance right? It's fine. Stop worrying about the white balance. Turn your camera to auto white balance, shoot raw, and take the photo. And if you're in a situation you really need it, use a gray card. But no matter how many gray cards you use, no matter how much you tweak in camera, no matter how many white balance accessories you buy, your white balance is never going to be perfect. Because there's no such thing. Because the only correct white balance in truth for your image is the one that you have right here. It's your visualization. This is why in the film days, it didn't matter that we more or less had two different white balances, a daylight and a tungsten. We shot for the aesthetic we were looking for. We understood light, or we were supposed to. It was hard sometimes. Now we have so much more power, but we fret more about white balance than we did in the days of film. And I think that's kind of funny. I think there's something to be learned from that. I think we need to focus on getting it right in camera, getting our exposure, our lines, our composition. Did you know that tweaking your white balance after you apply a black and white formula can actually radically affect your process and is a great way to mix? So I'll go in here to Silver 4, I'll apply a black and white formula that I like the look of, okay? And then I'll use white balance because it's changing the way that the algorithm is interpreting the color and converting it to black and white. So I can radically change the atmosphere of this image simply by adjusting the white balance. White balance is there to serve you. You're not there to serve white balance. And if you remember that and quit fretting about white balance, and then only use tools and aids and helps when it's actually going to make your images better, usually it's more for workflow than it is for color accuracy. Occasionally, you might be shooting video and you might need a target because you want to get it. Occasionally, you might need a tweak with white balance in camera. Most of the time, auto is going to be perfect. If you're shooting raw, you never, ever need to worry about white balance because you're losing nothing. Anything you can do in camera with a gray card, with a target over your lens, anything you can do in camera, if you're shooting raw, you can do easier and with more flexibility in post-production because it's a raw file. You've lost nothing. All right, guys, I hope you found this useful. I hope I didn't drag on. Let me know how you're liking these videos. Please like, please subscribe. I'll put some links to the presets I was showing you, and there's freebies and samplers of a lot of my preset packs over at seimeffects.com. So if you want to play around with some of these formulas yourself, try applying a formula first, a good formula. Get the aesthetic you want. Then tweak with your white balance. All right, peace, guys.